So here we'll talk about some steps we can take to actually analyze pivot chord modulations. Although it can be easy to forget as we're working with music that's originally presented to us in written form, we want to make sure we take time to actually listen to the music in question. Whether that means we play it ourselves or seek out recordings of it, we want to, give ourselves the opportunity to listen several times, and that's going to help us a lot in our analysis. As we're listening and as we're studying, we want to make sure that we identify the primary key. And as we're doing that, let's make a mental note of the closely related keys because those are going to be some of the most likely candidates in terms of targets of modulation. One of the hallmarks of a true modulation is that we'll actually have an authentic cadence within the context of the new key. So let's go ahead and look for cadences as we're listening and as we're studying, especially cadences that end on chords other than our original tonic. Once we've found those cadences, find the concluding chord and go ahead and back up. Is that conclusive chord preceded by another chord that we could interpret as its dominant? And then is that dominant preceded by what could be a predominant in this new key? Let's pay special close attention to that predominant because if that predominant chord is diatonic to both the new and the old keys, well, there's your pivot chord. Now, it's important to know that sometimes the pivoting action covers multiple chords, so we want to, kind of look before the predominant as well and see if, the previous chord could be part of that pivoting motion as well. As we're marking our analysis, we want to make sure that we use a pivot bracket to locate the point of the pivot chord or pivot chords. So the pivot chord itself will actually have two Roman numerals. Above the bracket, we're going to show the Roman numeral that would apply in the old key, and below the bracket, we're going to show the Roman numeral that would apply in the new key. All the chords analyzed up to the point of the pivot are going to be interpreted within the old key, and then all the chords analyzed after the pivot, those will be interpreted within the context of the new key. Now we'll go ahead and practice applying some of these steps as we examine a couple of different excerpts. So this movement from this Haydn piano sonata actually appears in our Burckhardt. It's on page 148, so feel free to grab that. And we'll use just the opening here as a means of analyzing or beginning to analyze pivot chords using the steps we just discussed. Of course, the first step we had was to actually listen. So go ahead and play this next set of recording from YouTube here as many times over to kind of get a sense of what's happening, certainly within these first 8 bars. All right, so as we listen to the opening and as we examine the music in front of us, it seems pretty convincing that we're in the key of D, right? And I say that not just because of the key signature here, because remember, key signatures can be misleading, but we kind of start off with this tonic idea, and then we kind of move through these chords here on the way to another tonic, right? So when we go ahead and analyze these chords, we see that we do in fact start off with a 1. Our next chord turns out is a 7-6. Which then moves to 5-7, and then 1. Okay, and remember, one of the things we want to do is we want to look for our cadences. So even though this is pretty short, I think I could potentially make a case for having an authentic cadence here, right? So let's go ahead and just mark that just for the sake of thoroughness. Okay, and as I go on, let's kind of see what happens. In the next bar, I return to a 5 chord. And then I see this A sharp. Well, we've been conditioned from our study of secondary chords to kind of look out for anything that for any accidentals, right? Any of these non-diatonic pitches, because they may suggest some kind of chromatic something, right? And in fact, this A sharp could be interpreted as a temporary leading tone to the B, because B turns out to be the root of this chord, which within the key of D major at least, I could interpret as a 6/6 chord. Right? Now, this A sharp is so late in the meter and it's metrically inconsequential enough to where I wouldn't necessarily try to go ahead and analyze the secondary chord here. You certainly could, but I think it's more important to recognize that I have the 5 on one side and the 6/6 on another. Now, a 6/6 chord, we've discussed in class how that's just kind of just a bizarre chord, just a weird way to stack a 6 chord, right? We usually like to see those in root position. So already I've got kind of a sense of, something might be going on here, right? But for the moment, I'll just kind of keep going, see what happens. In the next bar, I have what I'm going to interpret, at least with the key of D, looks like a 5/6/4, right? And that's kind of strange. So then I look next door. Well, now I've got another one of these accidentals popping up, right? So I leave a 5/6/4 and I come to this thing, right? And I say, That's an accidental. So I know to look for, maybe a secondary functioning chord, right? And I analyze this as an E major chord, which then leads to kind of this three A's in a row, which kind of gives us the impression of an A major chord, right? So I'll go ahead and call this a 5 of 5 leading to this 5 right here. Okay, and of course, it's a pretty incomplete 5. It's missing both a third and a fifth. But in this kind of pianistic writing, right, that there's enough context where we really hear those three A's as kind of suggesting an A major chord or a 5 chord here. But as I look at those last few labels, it just looks a little bizarre. We don't really talk about 5, 6, 4s in this kind of harmonic context, right? And then of 5 leading to 5. Right? I suppose one way we could analyze this is we could call a lot of this just kind of an elaborate secondary function, right? So, okay, well, let's just pretend we're doing a lot of things of 5, and we'll call this a cadential 6/4 of 5, leading to a 5 of 5, and then leading to 5. Well, I could summarize those first two chords, just clean this up a little bit, right? And just take both of these and put them over 1, 5, like that. Okay, and I suppose that could help me out in the last couple of bars, but I'm still scratching my head about this 6, 6, right? Because we really don't see 6 chords in first inversion, within a function within this key here. And so how could I explain that? Well, as I look at the anatomy of this thing, I've got a B minor chord, right, which certainly is a 6 chord in the key of D, but if I relate it to this eventual or rival to an A, I realize that, B minor chord exists in the key of A major. In fact, it exists as a 2 chord. And if I were to think of that as a 2-6 in the key of A, well, that makes a little more sense because we have more experience in terms of 2-6 being a very useful chord for us. So I think I'm actually going to identify this 6-6 chord as a pivot, because it exists in both keys, but actually seems to make a little more sense interpreted in A here, right? So I'm going to say that I'm going to pivot to the key of A, and that this 6-6 dually serves as a 2-6 in the key of A, right? And this cadential 6/4 of 5 now would just be interpreted as a cadential 6/4, okay? And then the 5 would just be interpreted as a 5, and then this incomplete chord here at the end would be an incomplete tonic within our new key. Okay, so let me just back up and explain this bracket here, right? You've seen me use it a few times this quarter. I want you to notice that it kind of looks like this strange little chair, and I use that to kind of show how this particular harmony here works in two different keys. In one key, it serves as a 6-6, and in another key, it serves as a 2-6. So that's kind of the definition of this thing pivoting us from D to A. And you'll see that I make the seat of the chair, so to speak, long enough to where I have room to write in the name of the key to which I am pivoting. So just make sure when we're writing those things that we account for those things as well. All of the chords I've identified up to this pivot chair are interpreted within the key, within my starting key of D major. Once the pivot arrives, okay, after this pivot chord itself, all of these chords are now interpreted or written or labeled in the context of the new key, in this case A major. So that's how we can identify and label pivot chords. Here's another example from our anthology, this one by Beethoven on page 283. Let's go ahead and analyze the trio. Let's start off by listening. All right, so obviously no shortage of energy in this one, right? So let's go ahead and do an analysis. I will tell you that we do start off in the key of B minor, right? Don't be fooled by this first harmony. This is really just kind of spelling out a 5 chord, okay? So why don't you pause and do the rest of the analysis and see where, if anywhere, Beethoven modulates here, and then come back and we'll compare notes. All right, so here is my analysis here. Again, starting in the key of B minor with a 5 chord. Now this is really kind of exciting. We're never playing more than, or the pianist is never playing more than 2 notes at a time. Really, it's really just a 2-part. But because of how Beethoven kind of walks through these harmonies, the chords themselves, or the harmonies implied here, seem to be pretty clear, at least to my ear, right? So we move from a 5 chord in this bar, which of course is a result of just kind of walking through, and this kind of resultant arpeggiation ends up in kind of a 5-6 chord here. Similar story at measure 72. The 5 resolves to 1, which by the end of the bar, as we kind of hear it in first inversion. Okay, and then we go to a 2-6-5, which just as by means of arpeggiation becomes a 2-7 here, to 5, and then 1-6. Okay, and then we walk down and just to make that a root position triad there. Okay, then 5-6 arpeggiates into a 6-4. Right now, 6-4, of course, we're used to only serving a few specific purposes, one of which we didn't really talk about because it doesn't require a lot of special voice leading consideration, is approaching 6-4 as a matter of arpeggiation. And that's really what Beethoven is doing here. He's arpeggiating from a 5-6 to a 5-6-4 with just kind of a passing tone in the middle. So this is perfectly legal. Okay, that results in a 1-6. And then similar passing motion, arpeggiating to 1-6-4. And then I analyzed this chord here as a 4-6 in the key of B minor, but then serving as a pivot chord, simultaneously serving as a 2 chord, a 2-6 in the key of D minor, right? Which again arpeggiates down to just to a 2. Actually, it's not a 7. It's really just a root position here. Okay, and then that goes to 5 in the key of D, right? And then 5 resolves to 1, 1-6, eventually stepping down into root position. So this one is a little bit different than the last example, because in the last example we kind of had accidentals really kind of signaling, that something different is happening here back on the Haydn. Well, notice that B is closely related to D in that they are relative keys. So when you have a minor, a piece starting off in minor, first of all, it's very common for the minor to modulate into its relative major, but you have to kind of be really on the lookout because we don't have those same accidental signals as frequently as we do in other kinds of modulations, precisely because they're relative keys, and which means that they share the same notes, they share a lot of the same chords, and so you really just kind of have to, again, backtrack. We had to notice that we ended in kind of a cadential moment here, right, with a 5-1 in the key of D, and then if I backed up even more, I could see that I can interpret this as a 2, right? So again, I found this kind of predominant, which kind of works in both keys, which is how I was able to label it as a pivot chord, right? So when you're navigating from a minor chord to the relative major, you do have to keep a bit more of a lookout because, again, we don't necessarily have those accidentals popping out at us.